Lisa sat with her granddaughter, Emily, in their seats on a delayed flight. She tried her best to keep Emily entertained with a small toy, while the cabin buzzed with the murmurs of restless passengers. The low hum of the air conditioning seemed almost futile against the rising tide of impatience. Lisa glanced at her watch and felt another wave of frustration wash over her. They had been waiting for nearly an hour, with no explanation from the flight crew. "Grandma, why aren't we flying yet?" Emily asked, her big eyes wide with curiosity. Her innocence was the only thing keeping Lisa grounded at the moment. "I don't know, sweetheart," Lisa replied, forcing a gentle smile despite her own irritation. "Sometimes these things take time." She hoped her voice would sound comforting enough for Emily, even if it didn't quite comfort herself. Just then, the cabin door opened, and Lisa noticed an elderly man making his way down the aisle. He moved slowly, struggling under the weight of his carry-on bag, his gait labored and slightly uneven due to a noticeable limp. Sympathetic eyes followed him as he made his way, but one pair of eyes, belonging to a sharply dressed man near the front, was filled with disdain. As the elderly gentleman shuffled along, his carry-on bag inadvertently brushed against the suited man's arm. "Watch where you're going," the man snapped, his voice dripping with condescension. "Do you even know what you're doing?" The elderly man flinched, mumbling an apology, his shoulders sinking. He kept moving, eventually reaching his seat near the back, where he struggled to lift his bag into the overhead compartment. It was clear that his strength was failing him, and as he tried once more, the bag slipped from his grasp, landing on the seat below with a thud. The man in the suit shot up from his seat, fury contorting his otherwise composed features. "What do you think you're doing?" he yelled, his voice a sharp knife, cutting through the cabin's uneasy silence. "Are you trying to hurt someone with that bag?" The elderly man's hands trembled as he stammered an apology. "I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to." "Didn't mean to?" the suited man interrupted, his voice rising. "People like you shouldn't be allowed to fly. You're a danger to everyone around you." Lisa's face flushed with anger. She looked around, hoping someone else would speak up, but all she saw were passengers shifting uncomfortably in their seats, their eyes averted. She could feel her own frustration bubbling inside her, a tight knot forming in her chest. Just as she was about to intervene, the flight attendant's voice came over the intercom, announcing that they were ready for takeoff. Lisa sighed, settling back into her seat. She hoped that the suited man would stop his tirade now that they were finally taking off. But her hopes were soon dashed. The man continued, his voice carrying over the cabin as he pressed the call button insistently. "I can't sit here," he declared loudly, pointing accusingly at the elderly gentleman. "The smell from him is making me nauseous." Lisa's jaw tightened. She couldn't stay silent any longer. Slowly, she stood up, her voice clear and steady as she addressed the suited man. "That's enough," she said, her eyes locking onto his. "This man deserves respect, not your insults." The suited man turned to her, an annoyed sneer twisting his lips. "Who do you think you are? This is none of your business." Lisa stood her ground. "It's everyone's business when someone is being treated unfairly," she replied, her voice unwavering. "This gentleman served our country, and he deserves better than to sit next to someone who disrespects him. Emily and I will give up our seats so he can be comfortable." She turned to Emily, who was watching her with wide eyes, absorbing every word. "Sweetheart, we're going to let this man have our seats. You'll sit on my lap?" "Okay," Lisa said gently. Emily nodded, her face serious as she took in the gravity of the moment. "Okay, Grandma," she replied without hesitation. The flight attendant, who had been watching the interaction, quickly stepped in to assist. "Thank you," she whispered to Lisa, her expression a mixture of gratitude and admiration. As Lisa and Emily gathered their belongings, the elderly man looked at Lisa, his eyes brimming with gratitude and surprise. "Thank you, ma'am," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "You didn't have to do this." Lisa smiled warmly at him. "It's the least we can do," she said. With the help of the flight attendant, they made the switch. The elderly gentleman settled into his new seat beside Lisa and Emily, visibly more at ease. The suited man huffed, but remained silent, though his glare lingered on Lisa before he turned away in frustration. As the plane began its journey, the tension in the cabin slowly started to dissipate. Lisa leaned over to Emily, whispering, "You did a very good thing today, sweetheart." Emily beamed up at her, her eyes shining with pride. "I'm glad we could help, Grandma." Lisa nodded, feeling her own heart swell with warmth. She knew that today had been about more than just offering a seat. It had been about teaching Emily the value of standing up for others, of showing kindness in the face of cruelty. And that, she thought, was worth every uncomfortable moment on this delayed flight. Once the plane reached cruising altitude, Lisa and Emily began to relax. Lisa leaned back in her seat, glancing over at the elderly man beside them, who had finally settled in. She noticed a worn hat resting on his lap, adorned with a faded military insignia. It caught her attention, and curiosity prompted her to speak. "That's an interesting hat," she remarked, nodding towards it. "Were you in the military?" The elderly man smiled gently, a nostalgic glint appearing in his eyes. "Yes, I was," he said softly. "I served in World War II in Korea. It feels like a lifetime ago, but some memories never fade." Emily, sitting beside her grandmother, leaned closer, her wide eyes filled with curiosity. "Did you fight in wars?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The man nodded, and his smile remained, though it was tinged with a hint of sadness. "I did," he replied. "My name is George, by the way. I was in a lot of battles. Some of them were tough, very tough." Lisa's eyes softened as she looked at George, imagining the years of sacrifice he must have endured. "Thank you for your service, George," she said sincerely. "My father served too, but he never made it back from Korea." George's expression changed, his eyes filling with empathy as they met Lisa's. He could see the pain still lingering there, even after all these years. "I'm so sorry to hear that," he said, his voice heavy with understanding. "Korea was brutal, and so many families were torn apart by it." Emily watched, her gaze moving back and forth between her grandmother and George. She had always heard bits and pieces about her great-grandfather, how brave he had been, how loved he was. Now, seeing this stranger who had lived through the same wars made it all feel more real. She looked at George, her voice tinged with awe. "Did you get hurt?" she asked, pointing at his leg, which appeared stiff. George looked down at his leg and then back at Emily, giving her a sad but kind smile. "Yes, sweetheart. I was injured in Korea. I got a bullet wound, and there's still some shrapnel in my leg that never quite healed. But you know what? I made it home, and for that, I am so very grateful." Lisa watched Emily's eyes widen with fascination. There was an innocence in Emily's curiosity that reminded her of herself as a young girl, always eager to know the stories of those who had come before her. She could see that Emily was enthralled by George's experiences. George seemed to notice as well, and after a moment of contemplation, he reached into his carry-on bag and pulled out a well-worn photo album. Its cover was faded and scuffed, evidence of years of handling. "Would you like to see some old photos?" he asked, his voice warm and inviting. Emily's eyes sparkled with excitement, and Lisa smiled, nodding. "We love that, George." George opened the album, and immediately, the pages seemed to come alive with black and white photos of young men in uniform. Lisa and Emily leaned closer as George pointed to different images, snapshots frozen in time of camaraderie, courage, and a youth spent in the midst of war. "This is my unit," George said, pointing to a photo of several young men standing side by side, each of them smiling broadly despite the circumstances. "We were just a bunch of kids, really. Some of the best men I ever knew." He paused, his finger moving to a tall man standing beside him. "And this," George continued, his voice tinged with a mixture of pride and sadness, "was my best friend, Jack." Lisa leaned in closer, her eyes narrowing as she studied the photo. There was something familiar about the man George had pointed out. She felt her heart skip a beat, and an inexplicable recognition washed over her. She had seen that face before, in old family photos, the ones her mother kept in a box at the top of her closet. "He looks familiar," she said, her voice trembling slightly as she stared at Jack's face. The resemblance was striking. George looked at her curiously, and Lisa swallowed hard. Do you have more photos of Jack?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. George nodded, flipping through the pages until he found another picture of Jack. This one showing him in the middle of a group of soldiers, his smile unmistakable. Lisa's heart pounded as she gazed at the photograph. The more she looked, the more certain she became. Her hands trembled slightly as she touched the edge of the picture. "George," she began, her voice shaky, I think Jack was my father." George's eyes widened, and his hand came to rest gently on the photograph. He looked at Lisa, his expression one of disbelief and wonder. "Your father?" he whispered, as if he could scarcely believe it himself. Lisa nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "My mother used to tell me stories about him. How brave he was, how he saved lives during the war, but never made it back home. I think that's him. I'm almost sure of it." George's eyes filled with tears, and he looked down at the picture, his thumb brushing lightly over Jack's smiling face. "If Jack was your father," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "then I owe him my life. He saved me more times than I can count. He was the bravest man I knew, and I think about him every single day." Lisa covered her mouth, overcome with emotion. Tears spilled down her cheeks, and she reached out, placing her hand over George's. "Thank you, George," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Thank you for telling me about him. I never knew the full story. I never knew how much he meant to the people he fought with." George shook his head, his own tears glistening. "It's me who should be thanking you, Lisa. Your father. He was my hero, and it's an honor to meet his daughter." Emily, who had been watching quietly, reached over and took George's hand, her small fingers curling around his. "My great-grandpa was a hero," she said softly, her eyes wide with awe. George nodded, smiling through his tears. "Yes, sweetheart. He truly was." The three of them sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the unexpected connection settling around them. It was as if the past and present had merged in that tiny airplane cabin, bringing with it a sense of closure, gratitude, and a deep, unspoken bond. As the plane began its descent, Lisa looked over at George, a thought forming in her mind. There was something she needed to do, something that felt right. She took a deep breath before speaking. "George, I have a favor to ask," she said, her voice trembling slightly, the weight of her emotions seeping through her words. "Would you come with us for a short drive once we land? There's someone I'd really like you to meet." George hesitated, his eyes searching Lisa's for an answer she hadn't yet spoken aloud. He could sense the importance of the request, the fragility in her voice. After a brief pause, he nodded. "All right, Lisa. I trust you." The plane touched down, and soon the three of them, Lisa, Emily, and George, were making their way through the bustling airport, weaving between travelers in a hurry to get on with their lives. The crowd around them seemed to fade into the background as Lisa focused on her purpose. She led George towards her car, helping him settle into the passenger seat, while Emily climbed into the back, her small face still filled with curiosity. They drove through a quiet suburban neighborhood, the streets lined with well-kept homes, each one with its own story to tell. Eventually, Lisa pulled into the driveway of a quaint house with a welcoming front porch. The garden was lush, with colorful flowers blooming along the walkway. Lisa glanced at George, who was looking around with a gentle smile. "This is where I grew up," Lisa said, her voice soft with nostalgia. "My mother still lives here. She's never moved away. This place means everything to her." George nodded, his eyes following the lines of the house. "It's beautiful," he said. "It looks like a place that holds a lot of memories." Lisa smiled, touched by his words. She led George and Emily up the porch steps, opening the front door and stepping inside. The familiar scent of home greeted her, a comforting blend of fresh-baked cookies and lavender. In the living room, her mother, Margaret, sat in her favorite chair, knitting a colorful scarf. She looked up as they entered, her eyes widening in surprise and curiosity as she took in the sight of the elderly man standing beside her daughter. "Mom," Lisa began, her voice filled with emotion. She paused for a moment, trying to gather herself, before continuing. This is George. He knew Dad. They fought together in the war. Margaret's knitting slipped from her hands, her eyes filling with tears as she stared at George. You knew Jack, she whispered, her voice cracking with the weight of unspoken memories. George nodded, his own eyes misting over. Yes, ma'am. Your husband saved my life more times than I can count. He was one of the finest men I ever had the honor to serve alongside. Margaret rose from her chair, her hands trembling as she moved towards George. She reached out, her fingers wrapping around his, holding them tightly as if to anchor herself. Thank you, she said, her voice breaking with emotion. Thank you for being here, for bringing a piece of him back to us. George swallowed hard, his gaze locked on Margaret's. He never stopped talking about you, ma'am. He carried your love with him everywhere he went. It's what kept him going. Margaret's tears spilled over, her heart swelling with both sorrow and joy. She led George over to the sofa, urging him to sit down. Lisa and Emily followed, settling onto the couch across from them. There was a moment of silence, heavy with emotion, as they all gathered their thoughts. Would you like some tea, George? Margaret asked, her voice gentle, her hands still trembling slightly. George smiled at her, nodding. That would be lovely, ma'am. Thank you. Margaret disappeared into the kitchen, and Lisa turned to George. I'm so glad you agreed to come, she said, her eyes glistening. I know this must be hard for you, but it means so much to us. George shook his head, his voice soft. It's not hard, Lisa. It's healing. I've carried Jack with me all these years, but coming here, meeting you and your mother, it's like a part of him is still here, living on through you. Lisa felt a lump form in her throat. She reached over, placing her hand on George's. He's always been with us, she said, her voice thick with emotion. But hearing your stories, it makes him feel closer than he's ever been. It's like I'm finally getting to know the side of him he never had the chance to share with us. Emily, who had been sitting quietly, finally spoke up, her small voice breaking the emotional silence. Great-Grandpa Jack was a hero, wasn't he, Grandma? She asked, looking from Lisa to George, her eyes wide with awe. George smiled, the tears slipping down his cheek. Yes, sweetheart, he said, his voice gentle. Your great-grandpa was the bravest man I ever knew. He was a hero, not just because of what he did in the war, but because of the way he loved his family. That kind of love, it's the most heroic thing of all. Margaret returned from the kitchen, carrying a tray with a pot of tea and a few cups. She set it down on the coffee table, her eyes still misty, but her smile warm. Let's sit together and share stories, she said, her voice steadier now. I'd love to hear more about the man Jack was, the things he did, the friends he made. We can keep his memory alive, together. George nodded, his heart swelling with both grief and gratitude. He picked up his cup of tea, savoring the warmth that seeped into his hands. I'd be honored, ma'am, he said. And there, in that cozy living room, surrounded by family and memories, they shared stories long into the evening, bringing Jack's spirit alive once more. The tales were filled with laughter, tears, and a deep sense of connection that transcended time, knitting together the past and the present, and forging a bond that would never be broken. The afternoon unfolded in a quiet, heartwarming blur, filled with stories of long ago. Margaret had gone to fetch a large, worn box from the back of a closet, a box filled with old photos, yellowing letters, and mementos from years past. She carefully brought it into the living room, setting it down on the coffee table. George looked at the box with a mixture of nostalgia and reverence, and Margaret began to gently take the photos out, laying them across the table for all to see. These are from before the war, Margaret explained, pointing to a black and white photo of Jack in a crisp suit, his arm wrapped around her. They were both smiling, young and hopeful. George leaned over, a soft smile spreading across his face as he looked at his old friend's beaming expression. I remember when Jack showed me this picture, George said, his voice rich with memories. It was back at the barracks one night. He always talked about you, Margaret. Said you were the light in his life, the reason he had something to fight for. Margaret's eyes misted over, and she let out a small laugh, shaking her head. He was always so sweet. It's why I fell for him, she said, her fingers brushing over the photograph. Emily, who had been sitting cross-legged on the floor, leaned forward, her eyes wide as she took in each photograph. She loved hearing these stories, loved learning about the man her mother and grandmother always spoke of with so much love. "Look at this one," Margaret said, her voice softening. She picked up another photo, one taken just before Jack had been deployed to Korea. He stood beside George, both of them dressed in their uniforms, their expressions a mix of determination and camaraderie. George took the photo, his fingers tracing over the image. "That was the day we said goodbye before shipping out," he said quietly. "Jack was always the one keeping our spirits up. No matter how hard things got, he'd always find a way to make us laugh. I can't tell you how much that mattered out there." Margaret nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "He wrote me letters about you, she said. He said you were like a brother to him, that he'd watch your back, and you'd watch his." George swallowed hard, the emotions of those days coming back in a rush. "He did watch my back, right up until the end," George said, his voice thick. "There were days I didn't think I'd make it home, but Jack, he made sure I did." Lisa watched this exchange, her heart full. She could see the deep bond that had formed between George and her father. A bond forged in the toughest of circumstances, yet one that had endured even after all these years. She reached over, placing her hand gently on her mother's shoulder. "He's always been with us," Lisa said softly. "In everything we do, in every memory we share. And today, having George here, it's like he's right here with us again." Margaret nodded, her smile trembling. She took a deep breath, looking over at Emily, who was still watching everything with rapt attention. "Your Grandpa Jack was a hero, wasn't he?" Emily asked, her voice full of wonder. Margaret smiled through her tears, her gaze meeting Emily's. "Yes, Emily," she said. "He was the bravest man I ever knew, not just because of the battles he fought, but because of how deeply he loved us. That love, that's the real bravery." George nodded, his eyes glistening. "Your grandfather was a true hero, Emily. He put others before himself, always. Even in the darkest times, he thought about his family and his friends. He was the reason many of us came back home." Emily beamed, her young heart swelling with pride. She reached out, her small fingers brushing against one of the photos of Jack. "I wish I could have met him," she whispered. Margaret leaned down, her voice gentle. "You do meet him, sweetheart, in every story we tell, and in every kind thing you do. He's always here with us, watching over you." The room fell into a warm silence as they sat together, each of them lost in their own thoughts, a mix of sorrow and gratitude. Lisa watched her mother and George, the way they shared each memory with care, and she knew that this was a day they would all cherish forever. It wasn't just about the stories themselves, but the act of remembering together, of bringing her father's memory back to life in a way that felt real and immediate. After a while, George pulled out a small, faded letter from his pocket. He looked at Margaret, his eyes kind. "I've kept this with me all these years," he said. "It was the last letter Jack wrote before everything happened. I thought you should have it." Margaret took the letter, her hands trembling slightly. She looked down at the familiar handwriting, her breath catching in her throat. Slowly, she unfolded it, her eyes scanning the words her husband had written so many years ago. Tears filled her eyes as she read his words of love, his promises to come home, and his hope for the future. "Thank you, George," Margaret whispered, her voice breaking. "Thank you for keeping this safe." George smiled, his own eyes misty. "He was my brother," he said simply. "I'd do anything to keep his memory alive." The afternoon light began to fade, casting a golden glow over the room. The stories continued, and so did the laughter and the tears. It was an afternoon of remembrance, of connection, and of honoring a man who had touched all of their lives in the most profound way. And as they sat there, sharing memories that spanned generations, they knew that Jack's spirit was right there with them, alive in every story, in every tear, and in every heartfelt laugh they shared together. As the evening sun began to dip below the horizon, a gentle glow filled the living room, casting long shadows across the walls. The comforting aroma of a simple but hearty dinner wafted through the house, and Margaret made sure that everyone felt at home, especially George. The meal was humble: a casserole, fresh-baked bread, and a salad, but the warmth and gratitude shared among them gave it a richness that went far beyond what was on the table. They sat together at the dining room table, laughter filling the space between bites. Emily peppered George with questions, her fascination growing as she learned more about her great-grandfather's adventures. George answered each question patiently, a glimmer of the young soldier still visible in his eyes as he recounted the days he and Jack had spent together, the camaraderie, the humor that kept them sane, and the weight of the challenges they faced side by side. "There was this one time," George began, smiling as he recalled the memory. "Jack and I got separated from our unit for a night. We were stuck in a small barn in the middle of nowhere. We had no idea if we'd find our way back. But Jack, well, he found an old guitar that had seen better days. Instead of panicking, he played it, singing the silliest songs you can imagine. We spent that whole night singing quietly to keep our spirits up." Margaret's eyes sparkled as she listened, her laughter joining George's as he finished the story. "That sounds just like Jack," she said, her voice filled with a mix of joy and nostalgia. "Always finding a way to make the best out of the worst situations." Lisa sat back, her heart full, watching her mother, her daughter, and George share these moments. It felt like a bridge had been built between generations, a way to reconnect with her father, who had always been a larger-than-life figure in her mind. She smiled, feeling an overwhelming sense of peace and gratitude. After dinner, they all moved into the living room. Margaret made tea, and they settled into the comfortable chairs and sofa, continuing their conversation as the day turned into night. The warmth of the room, the soft clinking of teacups, and the low hum of their voices created a sense of belonging that none of them wanted to let go of. After a while, Margaret looked over at George, a thought forming in her mind. She set her teacup down and spoke, her voice soft but filled with conviction. "George, why don't you stay here for a while? You're family now, and we'd love to have you with us." George looked at her, clearly touched. He hesitated, his eyes welling up. "I wouldn't want to impose," he began, his voice shaky with emotion. "Nonsense," Lisa interjected, her eyes shining with sincerity. "We'd be honored to have you here, George. You've brought us so much closer to Dad. It's like a part of him is here with us again, through you." Emily, who had been listening intently, suddenly clapped her hands together, her excitement bubbling over. "Please stay, Mr. George. I want to hear more stories about Great-Grandpa Jack," she said, her voice filled with innocent enthusiasm. George looked from Margaret to Lisa and then to Emily, his heart full. He had spent so many years alone, carrying Jack's memory with him like a heavy but precious burden. He never imagined he would find a place where he could share those memories so openly, where they would be cherished and celebrated. Tears welled up in his eyes, and he nodded, his voice barely a whisper. "All right," he said. "I'll stay." Margaret's face broke into a smile, and she reached out, covering George's hand with her own. "Welcome home, George," she said, her voice thick with emotion. The next few days passed in a joyful blur. George settled into the guest room, which Margaret had quickly made up for him with fresh linens and a vase of flowers by the bedside. He found himself slipping into their routine easily, helping Margaret in the garden, playing games with Emily, and sharing more stories with Lisa about her father's bravery and humor. One afternoon, George sat on the back porch, watching Emily play with her dolls in the yard. Lisa joined him, handing him a glass of lemonade before sitting down beside him. For a moment, they sat in silence, enjoying the gentle warmth of the sun and the simple pleasure of being together. "You know," George began, his voice reflective, "I've spent so many years wondering if I'd ever find a place where I truly felt at home again. After Jack was gone, I think a part of me just kept drifting. But being here, being with all of you, it's like I found my way back." Lisa smiled, her eyes glistening. "We're so glad you're here, George. You filled a space in our hearts we didn't even realize was empty. It's like Dad is here with us, through your stories and the love you have for him." George nodded, emotion catching in his throat. He looked over at Emily, her laughter ringing through the yard as she made her dolls dance. He would have loved her, George said softly. He always wanted a family, and now, seeing you all, I think he'd be happy. He'd be so proud. Lisa reached over, placing her hand gently on George's arm. We're proud to have you with us, and we're honored to carry on Dad's legacy together. That night, as the family gathered for dinner once again, Margaret made a toast. She lifted her glass, her eyes filled with warmth and gratitude. To George, she said, for bringing Jack back to us and for becoming a part of our family. We're so thankful to have you here. George raised his glass, his heart full. To family, he said, to new beginnings, and to remembering the ones we've loved. They clinked their glasses together, the sound echoing in the cozy dining room. It was a symbol of unity, of love, and of the new chapter they were beginning together. For George, it was more than just finding a place to stay. It was finding a family, a sense of belonging that he thought he had lost forever. And for Lisa, Margaret, and Emily, it was the joy of reconnecting with the past while building something new and beautiful in the present. As they laughed and shared stories over dinner, George knew that he was exactly where he was meant to be. A new beginning, one that was filled with love, warmth, and the spirit of his dearest friend, Jack, had finally begun. And in that moment, surrounded by his new family, he felt a deep, unshakable peace that he hadn't felt in years. It was the beginning of something wonderful, and he was ready to embrace it, one day at a time. The following weeks were a joyful blur, some of the happiest Lisa and her family had experienced in a long, long time. George fit right in, becoming a part of their everyday lives, as if he had always been there. His presence was like a balm for their hearts, a gentle reminder of the strength of family and the bonds that could never be broken, even by time or loss. George often spent his mornings helping Margaret with small tasks around the house. He had a way of making even the most mundane chores feel meaningful, turning them into opportunities for laughter and conversation. The two of them would work together in the garden, weeding the flower beds or trimming the hedges, all while sharing stories of Jack. Margaret would tell George about Jack's love for the garden, how he used to wake up early on weekends just to get a head start on the yard work. George would listen intently, occasionally adding his own memories, his voice tinged with fondness. Emily, meanwhile, had found in George a willing participant for her tea parties and make-believe games. She would invite him to her tiny tea set laid out in the backyard, where he would sit with his long legs folded awkwardly beneath the tiny table, sipping tea with great ceremony. He wore the plastic tiaras she gave him without complaint, his laughter ringing out as Emily chatted on, treating him like one of her dolls. To Emily, George was more than just her great-grandfather's friend. He was her friend, too, someone who filled the days with stories and warmth. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky with shades of orange and pink, the family gathered on the front porch. The air was filled with the scent of blooming flowers, and the gentle breeze carried with it the sounds of distant laughter from neighbors enjoying the warmth of the summer evening. George sat in the old wooden rocking chair, its familiar creak a comforting sound that seemed to match the rhythm of his memories. Margaret sat beside him, a knitted shawl draped over her shoulders, her eyes soft as she watched the sunset. Lisa was on the steps, a glass of lemonade in her hand, while Emily sat on George's knee, her eyes filled with wonder as she looked out at the colorful sky. There was a gentle silence between them, a comfortable stillness that only comes when people feel truly at home with one another. George rocked slowly in his chair, his gaze moving from the horizon to the faces around him. Finally, he broke the silence, his voice thick with emotion. "I never thought I'd find a family again," he said, his eyes misting over. "Jack was my brother, and losing him left a hole in my heart. I wandered for so many years, wondering if I'd ever find a place where I felt like I belonged. But being here with all of you, it's like I found a piece of him again. And for that, I can't thank you enough." Margaret reached over and took his hand, her eyes glistening. "You are family, George, and you always will be. Jack loved you like a brother, and we do too. You've brought him back to us in a way we never thought possible." Lisa nodded, her heart swelling with gratitude. She looked at Emily, who was resting against George's chest, her small fingers playing with the buttons on his shirt. Emily looked up at her mother, her eyes wide with curiosity. "Great-Grandpa Jack must have been really brave," she said softly. George smiled, his eyes shining. Emily, he was the bravest man I've ever known. But he wasn't just brave in battle. He was brave in love and kindness. He always knew how to make people feel special, how to take care of them. He made everyone around him better, just by being himself. Emily nodded thoughtfully, as if trying to understand the depth of what George was saying. Lisa reached over and gently ruffled her daughter's hair, her eyes meeting George's. "You've shown us so much about who Dad was," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You've helped us see him through your eyes, and it's like we're getting to know him all over again." As the sky darkened and the first stars began to twinkle, Lisa raised her glass of lemonade, her voice clear and strong. "To Dad," she said, her eyes glancing between George, Margaret, and Emily. "To George, and to all the heroes who protect us in big ways and small." They all raised their glasses, Margaret with her cup of tea, George with his lemonade, and even Emily with her juice box. The clinking of their glasses was a soft, almost musical sound that echoed across the porch, a symbol of unity, of love, and of the bonds that endure beyond time and distance. For George, this was more than just a toast. It was a promise, a commitment to cherish the time they had together, to honor Jack's memory not just with words, but with love and kindness. As he looked around at the faces of the family that had taken him in, he felt a sense of fulfillment that he had not known in years. The ache of loss, the loneliness he had carried for so long, was slowly being replaced with something far more beautiful, a sense of belonging, of being part of something bigger than himself. Margaret leaned back in her chair, her eyes closed, a peaceful smile on her lips. "I think Jack is smiling down on us right now," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. George nodded, his heart full. "I think he is too," he replied, his eyes fixed on the stars twinkling above them. "I think he's happy we found each other." The evening wore on, and eventually, the laughter and stories gave way to a quiet stillness, the kind that comes when people are truly at peace. As they all sat there, watching the stars, George knew that he had found his home, not just in a house, but in the hearts of those around him. It was a new beginning, one filled with cherished memories, new bonds, and the enduring spirit of a man who had touched all of their lives. And as the night deepened, George felt that he was no longer lost, no longer wandering. He was home, surrounded by love, and it was more than he could have ever hoped for. Hey everyone, thank you so much for joining me on this heartfelt journey. The story we shared today is a beautiful reminder of how a small act of kindness can lead to something extraordinary. A little girl's compassion sparked an incredible reunion, bringing lost pieces of family history back together and showing us the true power of connection and love. Lisa and Emily's bravery in standing up for George was a profound testament to the impact we can have when we choose empathy over indifference. Their actions remind us that even the smallest gestures can create ripples that touch others in unexpected ways. I'd love to hear your thoughts. What would you have done if you were in Lisa's shoes? Have you ever had an experience where standing up for someone made all the difference? Please share your stories in the comments below or reach out to me via email. And if this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who might need a little extra warmth and inspiration today. Until next time, keep spreading kindness, stay connected, and cherish those around you. Take care, everyone.